Hello, everyone. I'll give it a second while everybody starts coming in. My name is Sadie. I work with AIHM in membership and in the fellowship. Today, we're going to have a webinar, and it's going to be it's called the Textile Health Crisis, what every medical professional needs to know about PFAs and chemical exposure. Just giving a second here for people to kind of come in, maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and then I'll go ahead and present a panelist, and let them take over afterwards. And I see the panelists are coming in now, so let's see. I see Karen as well, so let me. Okay, so I think all the panelists should be in now. Great. So if you liked, so that way we kind of stay on time, I can start introducing the panelist and you guys can take it from there. Sound good? Okay. Karen, when you can, go ahead and turn on your camera. There you are. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our panelists today. I have Dr. Chris Holder, naturopathic oncologist, working with California firefighters to detoxify the PFAs from the body with a focus on the link between toxicology in cancer patients and exposure to environmental toxins. And then Alden Wicker. Say hello. An award-winning journalist and author to die for, known for her investigative work on the hidden risk in fashion and textiles. And Miss Karen Wade, legal advisor specializing in regulatory affairs and environmental law, specializing in biological weapons and emergency preparedness and response. Welcome all, and thank you for being here. I'll let you guys take over from now. I'll turn off my mic and video.
Thank you, Sadie, for that wonderful introduction. I'm Dr. Chris Holder. I'll be your host and moderator for tonight. And I'm super excited for this conversation with Alden and Karen. We have a great night for you guys with a lot of information. So let's dive right in. Alden, you wrote this amazing book to die for, exposing something that I, working in toxicology, had never really even considered. I'm always looking at plastics and pesticides and herbicides and things like that in my patients, and I was completely dumbfounded to learn that both textile and the dyes in textile might be a source of toxics in my patients. How did you get interested in this topic?
Yeah, so I have been writing about fashion sustainability for a really long time, since probably 2011. And so I had written about a lot of fashion's negative impacts on the environment and people, workers. But I until 2019, I also had never heard about fashion having toxic chemicals in it. And that was the year when a radio station asked me to comment on a lawsuit that was being brought by airline attendants against Lands' End, who made their uniforms, because they said that their uniforms were making them very, very sick. So usually the symptoms would start with a rash or a skin burn, swollen eyes. Some of them had a cough, a persistent cough when they were wearing the uniforms. Extreme fatigue. Some of them will get sort of flu-like symptoms, like hot, like feeling hot and tired when they were wearing them. Some of them started losing their hair, like male pattern
Mm.
baldness, or losing all of their hair. Some of them just couldn't work on the plane wearing the uniform or being around their colleagues who were wearing the uniform. And so this wasn't the only place that it happened. This had happened at Alaska Airlines. It happened at American Airlines and Southwest as well. And all of these, like none of them, there were different airlines. They were using different uniform makers, 3 different uniform makers. And these uniforms were being made all over the world. So the commonality was the fact that these uniforms were new. They were introduced new at each of these places. They were synthetic blends, and then they would have layers and layers of chemical finishes to provide them with flame retardancy, stain resistance, anti-wrinkle, anti-fungal, anti-odor, bright colors, and they were made as cheaply as possible. And so that was the first time I'd heard about fashion being toxic. And I just spent the next 4 years researching this. And then I uncovered more than I ever thought I would. I wanted to know what was in the uniforms. And I also wanted to know, is this also happening to normal people if it's happening to these flight attendants? And the answer is yes. It's much more subtle because we wear so many different things all the time. So it's hard to figure out what is going on. But almost everything I just named, the heavy metals, the endocrine disruptors, the allergens, skin sensitizers, carcinogens, those are almost all found in normal clothing as well.
And why would those things be found in the normal clothing? Why would a manufacturer want to put these things in there?
That's a good question. Some of these things are purposefully added. So in the case of PFAS, it's added to provide water resistance to hiking and outdoor clothes and stain repellency. And manufacturers said, oh, we switched away from the worst ones. But of course, the evidence is very strongly pointing to the fact that all types of PFAS have carcinogenic and reproductive toxic effects. And they're all forever chemicals. They all never break down or go away. Some of these, and so like anti-odor finishes, anti-wrinkle finishes, dyes, of course, all of these things are added on purpose. And then you have plastics, which a lot of people don't realize that polyester is a plastic, nylon is a plastic, acrylic is a plastic. And so you have the same plasticizers and endocrine disruptors in these textile plastics as you do in food containers and other uses of plastic. So PVC is used to create vegan leather things or pleather things. And it's also the, toxic off-gassing plastic that's used in homes and other places. So there's things that are purposely used. And then you have accidental contaminants. So these, a lot of these, especially if they're made really cheaply, the factory is not getting certified chemicals or dyes from a reputable supplier. They're going down the street to get the cheapest dyes and chemicals that they can find. They're often sort of reused from the pharmaceutical industry or the mining industry. And then you have these fabrics are going all over the place. So they might encounter pesticides and fungicides when they're being stored or shipped to us. And so those are those accidental contaminations that can happen. And there's lots of different ways that can happen throughout the supply chain because it's an extremely complex supply chain. And then some of them you can wash off and some of them you can't. They're going to stick around.
Fascinating. So, and is there any science on the topic of can we actually absorb this through our skin?
Yeah, so there was some research that came out earlier this year showing that you can absorb phthalates through your skin. And so if you're wearing a leather product, or say, for example, jelly shoes, which are really popular.
Mm-hmm.
If your kids are wearing jelly shoes and they're sweating in them, they can absorb the phthalates that are leaching out of those PVC jelly shoes into their skin. There needs to be more research on like how much PFAS we absorb when it gets onto our skin, and how much BPA we absorb when it gets onto our skin. But there's also research showing that sweat is especially good at drawing hazardous chemicals out, especially of plastics, polyester, like stretchy polyester workout gear, which also has been found to have BPA, and depositing on your skin. And if it's the kind of thing that can be absorbed by your skin, which we know a lot of things are, that's one route of exposure.
That's so amazing to think about because I run these toxicology tests in my practice for both cancer patients and firefighters, and we often see, in fact, BPA is one of the top things that I see for women with breast cancer, but it never occurred to me until conversations with Azome that that source of BPA might be their tights
There's
or
sports bras, yeah.
or their sports bras. Whereas, I always said, this is coming from a plastic water bottle, a Tupperware container, these sorts of things. It just did not occur to me that it could mobilize in that way. Is there research on the topic showing mobilization of BPA and phthalates
From
through the
textile?
skin, from textile?
There is not research yet, unfortunately. We do know that BPA has been found in at high amounts, at very high amounts in polyester spandex stretchy workout gear. Not just in tiny brands, not just in brands like Shein and Temu, but large sportswear brands that supposedly have pretty strong chemical management programs. So it seems like less a sloppy error and more like a function of the spandex and polyester blend fabric.
hmm And then, as I understand it as well, not only is the actual material problematic, but also the dyes. Um, Tell me
Yeah.
what you know about dye transfer and how that migrates and what sort of symptoms we'd be looking for in our patients.
Yeah, so there's only one type of dye at this point that is used to dye um, synthetic fabrics like polyester and nylon and acrylic. And they're called dispersed dyes. And if you're a dermatologist, you might recognize dispersed dyes because if you do a pretty basic patch test to find out what's making someone react or having skin problems, dispersed blue something something and dispersed black will be in that patch test of like known common allergens. One study out of Europe like estimated that up to 8% of their patients were reacting specifically to dispersed dyes. And then there's new research that came out of Duke over the past few years, led by Dr. Heather Stapleton's um, team, that shows that these dispersed dyes do cause skin sensitization. So they looked at 12 different dispersed dyes, and all of them showed signs that they would cause skin sensitization. So, and just anecdotally, what you hear from people is like, so for example, so I've been saying in my book, like, just try to avoid synthetic fibers for all the reasons I just described. And so, again, this is anecdotal, but an acquaintance of mine said she was having really bad acne on her back, and she kept going to her doctor, and she changed her diet, and she changed what personal care products she was using, and she tried everything. And the doctor said, "Look, we've tried everything. I don't know." She stopped using scented detergent. "We've tried everything. I don't really know what it is. Here's a steroid cream." And then she read my book and she stopped wearing synthetic clothing. And she said that cleared up the problem completely. You also hear similar stories in my book from a mother of a child who had very severe eczema to the point where he had open sores and was bleeding. He wouldn't get dressed in the morning. And finally, she figured out, oh, this is coming from the clothing I'm dressing him in, and switching out to certified non-toxic natural fibers. Like, it didn't completely heal. It's always going to be with him, but it's managing it much better now. It's gone way, way down.
Amazing. Karen, can you tell us a little bit about legal and regulatory elements of this? I'm dumbfounded that this is allowed into the clothing chain. How is this all possible?
Well, in some ways, that could be a very short answer because I think as consumers, we expect that there is a regulatory pathway or chain that is based on themselves or the health and safety of the ultimate end user product. And that's not really the case. That's not how, especially in this industry, how textiles, consumer products, what you can buy off the shelf is regulated. You know, when we talk about a label in textiles not being an ingredient list, there's no requirement, there's no regulatory requirement, there's no oversight to say what chemicals have been used to make this textile, to make this garment, to make this bedding. So given that there's a patchwork of regulations in the environmental law field, so EPA and FTC and FDA, they all have their jurisdictions, they all have what they're in charge of. The short answer is no one is in charge of this. Alden can speak to this a little bit as she tried to figure out, okay, what happens if there's a dangerous chemical being used in textiles? What is where do we go to complain about that? And it took a whole book for her to even touch on the issues.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
tell us more.
the short answer is that the federal government does not regulate any chemicals in clothing except for three and only for children's products: cadmium, phthalates, and lead, certain phthalates and lead. So there's nothing illegal about putting something like chlordane, which is a pesticide that's been banned for use in sale in the United States since the 1980s, in an adult piece of clothing and selling it to an American. It's all voluntary. The strongest regulations we have right now are California's Prop 65, which does not ban the use of chemicals. It just says if lead is in your product or, phthalates or BPA, then you have to label it. And that's actually done a lot because companies don't want to say that their product has a reproductive toxic or carcinogenic chemical in there. And actually there was a study that came out a couple of weeks ago showing that Prop 65 has actually been really effective. They compared the presence of a short list of chemicals that are on that Prop 65 list in the blood of Americans before Prop 65 went into effect and after, and they found that it had dropped in all of them had dropped in Californians' blood a lot, but across the board in Americans as well, somewhat less, because a lot of companies, they're not going to make a special product for California. So that's actually been really effective, but it's not banning certain chemicals. And the fact of the matter is if your teenage daughter orders a product from Shein, nobody is actually looking at it in between it leaving the factory and her opening it. It could smell like gasoline and nobody would notice until she opens it. And whether or not she's gonna put it back and return it or just be like, I don't know, I'm assuming that I'm protected in some way and put it on. Yeah, I guess that's up to her.
So there's no real truth and disclosure happening here, how does one begin to protect oneself from what may or may not be in their clothing?
Yeah, so it is difficult. If you let's say you do get a patch test and it shows that you're reacting to formaldehyde, dispersed blue, dye, and nickel, you're gonna have a really hard time, as Karen said, figuring out what clothing has that because the labels just say the fabric, anything that's over 5% of the weight of the fabric. So you have to kind of play detective a little bit, but there are some things you can do when you combine all these things together. You will reduce your exposure to some of these chemicals. So for example, I said earlier, try to buy natural fiber whenever you can. So cotton, silk, linen, hemp, wool, and other animal fibers. Lyocell, Tencel, Modal, all of those are good too. Those are semi-synthetic, but they're plant-based, and they're especially like bamboo rayon tends to do well for people who have sensitive skin. Also, I tell people to avoid performance and marketing promises. So if it promises to be wrinkle-free or stain resistant or has a fancy brand name where usually it would say the actually what the fabric is, I usually that's so that they can charge more, and also that's usually achieved with either a synthetic plastic material and or a chemical finish. And then I always tell people, like, don't buy ultra fast fashion brands. Don't buy from Temu. Don't buy from Shein. Don't buy from that random social media brand that you've never heard of before, or that random brand with a gibberish name on Amazon. And always wash your clothing before you wear it if it's new.
Are there brands that are cleaner than others?
Yeah,
That's
absolutely. I mean, we
specialized
have
in this?
Izome here,
Hmm.
which makes these like beautiful, completely natural sheets that are so good for the skin. And then you also have there are some small brands that are really, really focused on this. And we list all of these at my website, EcoCult, ECOCULT. And so there's smaller brands that are just super focused on this, like Cottonique,
Okay.
and some other brands like that. And then, but then you have large mall brands that are okay, like the in-house brands at Target are great. Again, you should try to buy natural fiber anyway, even if you're shopping at the in-house brands at Target, but they have a pretty strong chemical management program. So does Levi's, so does H&M. There's brands like that that really, really do care. Again, you can find that list on ecocult.com.
Yeah, I was particularly interested in Azome's concept of non-toxic bedding, since we spend about a third of our lives in bed. For me, that was an obvious place to start with patients, because they could cut down so much exposure by just that particular purchase. Um, is there any data or ideas on how long these treatments and chemicals and dyes last? Like, if I wash my clothes 10 times, is that going to reduce it, or is it still going to be a problem through the life of the clothing?
Do you want to take this one, Karen? I feel like you have so much experience with cleaning up things.
Yeah, well, my background is in this kind of contamination. So when we list out the chemicals that are being used in our textiles, we're also going through a list of chemicals that are banned in other uses and other contexts, right? So formaldehyde is a prime example of this. So, a lot of what, as Alden said, a lot of these chemicals are being used to stay in the clothing for their residual effect. So this water resistant, stain repellent, oil repellent, that functionality comes with that chemical makeup, and that is meant to stay in the clothing. Same thing with the dyes. If you can see it, and you can still see it after washing it many times, there are things retained in the fabric. And then you get into different questions about the exposure pathway and what may come off of that fabric in the form of microplastics or erosion or things of that nature. So the short answer is, washing new clothes helps to get off the chemicals that were possibly put on or that will come off, but over time, those exposure pathways remain. For some of those chemicals, PFAS is a great example, that were meant to stay in the fabric to have their function. It also, of course, matters what the fabric is made of itself. So does it pill? Does it bleed? Does it break down? I mean, anyone that's done a lot of laundry, as I have done, I'm a mom of kids. You can see that type of breakdown, in over time with clothing, and you can see that, for example, microplastics is becoming a more well-known issue. So, yeah, I think washing your clothing, there's a case to be made for secondhand clothing and not the brand new. Holding on to some of these better textiles for a longer period of time, buying less new, all of that are all smart ideas to reduce your exposure to this constant new, because it will take time, I think, to have better options out there, you know, in terms of brands making these changes, in terms of there are regulatory changes that will take some time to get to the right choice for the consumer. But the short answer is, you know, these chemicals and these functions were put in to remain in the textiles for certain reasons. And so without the awareness of that, and a little bit of changing the education around these chemicals, you need that choice to say, I don't want to bring this into my home, or I don't want to bring it into my sleeping environment, or, you know, even in activewear, for example. I think, Alden, you mentioned this in your book, but anything that involves activewear, sweating, things, even that awareness to take those clothes off as soon as you're done with your exercise, to put them outside. You know, we used to talk about reducing exposure, but you do have some control over your home environment, over your sleeping environment, over what you wear every day. So making these types of changes will help.
Are there any athletic companies specializing in performance fabrics that are natural and not synthetic?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch. Again, we list them. So actually our most popular article on EcoCult is plastic-free activewear by far. So there's a few. There's like the outdoor brands that do like the merino wool. There's a lot of brands now that make merino wool underwear, and sports bras and regular bras. And it's actually a really high performance, skin-friendly fabric that's sort of moisture regulating and heat regulating. And then you also have brands that are using like organic cotton with just a little bit of spandex. So you have like Mate the Label, and some others where you can get almost completely synthetic free clothing. It's a little bit harder to find yoga leggings that are free even of spandex, which doesn't tend to give people a huge problem, but if people are super, super sensitive, then maybe they'll have to switch to like Cotonique does like a completely plastic free, but it's really hard to find a supported sports bra in natural fibers, unfortunately.
Yeah, it seems to me the challenge is like getting the stretch right for a lot of these applications. Um, are there anything in the natural world that works in terms of that stretch?
There's one denim brand that uses actually like natural rubber to
Wow.
create that stretch. There's companies working on like a bio-based alternative, but from my research and the researchers I've talked to, bio-based plastics actually can be just as toxic as regular plastics, so that's not a solution in this case, unfortunately.
That makes sense to me because you still would have to plasticize it and
Exactly.
use a plasticizer, so you'd have all the same issues. Here's a question I'd love to hear both of you kind of chime in on, and that's in terms of like, what's your best case scenario and best wishes in terms of regulation of textile? What should be done now that you guys are so knowledgeable on the problem?
Well, I think so. I was talking to some advocates who were asking me like, hey, if we wanted to work on legislation around this, like what should we try first? And I would love to see complete lists of what is in clothing. And barring that, I would love to see at least a complete list of allergens, right? Like food says like this contains peanuts or this contains dairy. Clothing should say like this contains formaldehyde, this contains PFAS, this contains, disperse dye so that people can make those choices. I think that would make a huge difference for just making people aware that these things are even in clothing. I'd also like to see um, the Consumer Product Safety Commission be more well funded to actually protect consumers because they do get reports, but they haven't really been going after brands or for having when they cause these reactions in people. And so there's just not enough money for testing and everything, which is expensive. Um, and Yeah, I would like to see it I would like to see, and maybe this will happen soon, is potentially it is so much cheaper to buy something from Shein that's been made across the world really, really cheaply than it is to buy from a responsible company that's using natural fibers. And so these companies, these ultra fast fashion brands are growing really, really quickly. And there's no oversight. Like the packages are just going straight from the factory to people. They're being mislabeled. They every time they test these things, every time they test Shein and Temu, they find things like lead and phthalates and other hazardous chemicals in there. And so that's going in the wrong direction for sure. Karen, what do you think?
Aaron, yeah,
Well, I was just thinking, you know, as consumers, I think I agree the Consumer Protection Agency could use funding on this because the complaints come to them and they do have a structure in place. But testing the end product when something is manufactured in such a complex way using untold amount of chemicals. You know, there's between 3 and 13,000 PFAS chemicals in that class. There's over 8,000, 10,000, depending on which figure you want to cite, of chemicals used. I think that's just mind-boggling to a lot of end consumers. And the idea that you're going to take this final product that you might be able to order online and then test it for, you know, suspect chemicals or known allergens or known carcinogens, that's not really how it works. If you're testing the end product to be sure something's not in it, you've already lost, right? Because if something's manufactured with these chemicals and they're meant to stay in the garment, you know, Alden talks about her testing some of the things for the things she just listed. And it was, you know, the cost of the test was, you know,
$10,000.
100x of the actual piece of clothing, the shoes. So we're not going to be able to test our way out of this and declare something to be non-toxic. There are certifications, there are better ways to know better about what the company is doing and what their supply chain transparency is. And so that is a movement in the right direction. But do understand, if we're going to use these chemicals that we know are problematic in the manufacturing process, then testing them at the end of the line doesn't help, right? Doesn't really solve the problem. I think we do have to do incentives and encourage and some regulatory piece to get the worst offenders out of the chemical supply chain. And that's beginning to happen with education and awareness, you know, the bans on PFAS and manufacturing that are coming into place down the line. But given, like you said, the global supply chain, what consumers need to do is start to become aware, educated. And as you said, Chris, you weren't aware of toxicities in this textiles as a potential exposure pathway or problem for patients. So I do think even in the last couple of years, this is changing. And so as demand goes up for natural synthetic free fibers, dyes, manufacturing processes, there are ways in which things can be done better. You know, you don't necessarily need to use 150 different types of chemicals to manufacture textiles and garment. It's just that I think, you know, as the founder of Izame once said, when he began this journey 7 or 8 years ago, nobody cared. Well, people do care, you know, people do care once they know that that this is a problem. And then consumers care to have a better choice. And I think, you know, patients going in with these chronic issues have the same complaints over and over again and are not getting the right solutions or the right relief.
Aaron,
Yeah,
can you
and
tell us? Oh, sorry, Alden. Go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say, like, it's actually somebody asked in the chat, like, why would companies do this? They don't have any interest in making us sick. And the thing is that there's it's very hard to hold companies accountable for putting this, like, it's the epidemiology of proving that your breast cancer comes from wearing a certain sports bra by a certain brand is actually impossible. And I've talked to people who, when they figured out it was the textiles, it took them a really long time because some of these reactions, I mean, some of them happen right away, but some of these reactions, especially with skin, they'll happen 3 days later. So I talked to a woman who she finally figured out it was blue dispersed dye that was causing the problem. It's probably all dispersed dye, to be honest, but that was what came up in the test. And she will go to the store and she'll buy things from a store with a good return policy, wear it, and then wait 3 days to see if something's going to show up. So it's kind of like if you think that
Use the
you're
test.
yeah, it's kind of like an elimination diet where like you have to eliminate all of the potential things from from your closet and start to add things back in to slowly to see what might be causing the problem. And there have been lawsuits and they've very few of them have been won. So usually the companies will say, well, like you need to get your clothing tested and find out which of these substances are above the limit and then connect those substances that are above the limit to all of your symptoms. That's what was happening in the airline attendance case. It's what happened when a lot of children got really gnarly rashes from tags in their children's clothing from Carter's. This is like 15 years ago. It happened with Victoria's Secret. Now we know a lot more. And so finally, one of the groups of flight attendants from American Airlines won a lawsuit against Twin Hill, who made their uniforms. But it's just really hard to make that connection. And so there's not really much of an incentive for brands, especially brands that are hyper focused on price, to pay for testing, to pay a little bit more to work with factories who are reputable and who that use more expensive certified safe dyes and chemicals. It's just they're very hyper focused on price, and when that happens, sloppy things happen.
Karen, can you tell us a little more about the process of if you are going to make something natural and chemical free? What's that like? What are you guys looking for in factories? What's your process?
Well, and as I said earlier, and Alden reiterated, there's no regulatory reason why these chemicals can't be used in clothing, but there are regulatory frameworks around pesticides and chemical management systems and in that industry, and those are very complex, if you will. So we also know, standards are usually set in place for chemicals in terms of worker safety or occupational hazards or lower limits, or the use of pesticides is registered through the EPA with a label. And those are fairly complex and well-known processes. But the global supply chain, doesn't, each country has their own different systems, and you enter into a really complex, supply chain where there isn't an enforcement mechanism. There's not a lot of transparency. So working with a brand that makes things differently, starting with a textile that's a natural, right? Not synthetic textiles, polyester, they're plastic. They're made of plastic, so the process is going to include a lot of chemicals. But if you're looking for different choices, I see companies that are doing things differently, right? So you have different pathways of irritants. Yes, one from the chemistry itself, or from the dispersed dyes, or from mechanical irritants. Alden just mentioned the tag. And as awareness goes up, or people are looking for these irritants to be out of their textiles, then Isomay, for example, doesn't use chemical mordants. It uses an ultrasonic technology.
Explain for our viewers what that means.
The ultrasound. Well, a lot of, the chemistry involved at every step of the lifetime of a garment is really complex. So why do those colors stay inside my clothes, right? That's all chemistry. How is something weaved? How do we wash it? How do we prevent shrinking? Chemistry and chemicals are used at every stage of that in a traditional textile, right? You talk about like conventional textile. Even what the textile and the fabric is made from. So one of the things, at least at Izame, that was done is finding a different way to make a natural dyes color fast, right? Because that's traditionally been why saying, oh, we need these types of dyes and these types of things because we need them to stay, we want it to stay, we want the blue to stay blue, right? We don't want to wash our clothing and have them, all change colors back. So one of the ways that Izame does this with their bedding is an ultrasonic technology. So it's essentially a mechanical wave technology that eliminates the need for the traditional chemical mordants, and so that these natural dyes can stay color fast inside the fabric. And I think encouraging that kind of innovation, right? Different weaves to reduce mechanical irritation, different instead of looking for new bioplastics and new fancy ways that take more and more processing, how do we get our textiles to be less processed, just as you would in the organic food movement, less processed, and still have the function that we're looking for, right? Maybe it takes a little bit more care to keep the life of the garment in a different shape. Maybe maybe it looks a little different, but making these textile choices and changes as the demand increases and as personal health becomes the thing that you are, most looking for, right? To swap out these changes. We see a patient population that's coming forward with skin disease and with problems. So they want to know, what are the swaps that I can make? And although the alternatives might not be plenty, there are swaps that can be made, for example, in bedding, activewear, things that you wear all the time. There are swaps that can be made immediately that, if you read Alden's book and if you start looking at the literature and the science here, these swap outs of the better alternatives that are available today have made a big difference for patients. And I am an optimist, so I think regulatory change will happen, but that certainly won't happen in time for patients to feel an effect. They can make these swaps now and really test themselves to see, do you feel better? I've always thought a little bit of this problem, fast fashion, it's complex, but I also sense that people are not feeling good in their clothes, right? In their textiles. And this continually, new. Part of it, I truly believe, is that, the body knows that something's not right here. And not many people, Alden, you talked about unpacking your big, load and your friend having an immediate reaction. Not everybody immediately reacts to these chemicals in clothes. That doesn't mean they're not there. That doesn't mean that over time there's not a low level exposure. We know that can be problematic. And so without this exposure, patient populations that have skin sensitivities and immediate reactions, they do better, right? But if we want the choice for us all to do better for our personal health, then we need to move in the direction of making these alternative technologies and alternative ways of manufacturing textiles more like food, less like, less like a plastic industry, right? That's going to get better with chemicals.
Is this challenging when you talk to a factory? Are they amenable to making these changes?
Alden, you've been on factory grounds. I mean, a smart and safe chemical management system is in everybody's best interest, wherever that factory is located. So
yeah, it is, but it's expensive to do. There are a network of factories. There's an organization that actually has been really great called ZDHC, Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals. And they've done a lot of really good work to work with factories to say, like, to come up with a list, first of all, of chemicals that should never be used, and then test effluent and enforce that restricted substance list for factories. But, I just got an email today from somebody talking about how they tried to create a completely synthetic free brand. And the fact she would specify silk embroidery, and they would put silk-like polyester embroidery. And she would say, I need a natural interfacing behind that embroidery, and they would put a polyester facing. And like, it's really hard to specify this for factories because they're just not used to doing it. And like, frankly, a lot of them are sketchy. They'll just tell you whatever. They'll be like, yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure, for sure. And then they won't do it. And because it's more expensive to do it this way.
And making any kind of change is expensive, right? Theoretically, there are capital costs to make a change into how you manufacture. You think it'd be easier. Don't use these chemicals. Don't use these chemicals at this stage, this stage, this stage. But that transparency and being inside the factory face to face and inspecting and things like that. I mean, that's what we've been doing at Izame, but not a lot of companies can or are willing to do that.
What are some of the positive effects that can come from using natural fiber or natural-based dyes? Are there any benefits?
And this, I think, yeah.
Well, what are the benefits? I mean, you don't have all those negatives happening. But Alden, why don't you take that question first and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it gets rid of a lot of these negatives. But I think, also there's been some research, and historically indigo, for example, has been used as a healing, like a healing medicine for the skin. And Karen, there's some research on the microbiome as well, right?
Well, the skin microbiome, right? So the benefits, right? What we see and what we've probably talked about so far is, we know this chemistry, these chemicals to be an issue because we've seen they've been studied in other contexts, and they're known carcinogens, they're known endocrine disruptors, they're known skin sensitizers. Now you think about, okay, we don't use any of those, but what traditionally has been used to dye and make clothing, right? If we get back to natural fibers, if we get back to like what we use, traditional medicinal dye, natural dyes, organic, right? What could we impart to textiles that is actually beneficial, not harmful? And that's the area that I'm excited about to see what happens. But I think the first step is always eliminating what might be causing a reaction or being absorbed into your skin. We think, it's odd because we are a porous, biological system. And I think a lot of people in the industry think, well, it washes out, you wear it, it doesn't have a way to get inside. But then you go to a doctor and they say the first thing you do is to change what you're eating, right? Your nutrition, what have you done? So seeing the skin as our largest organ, which is a porous, barrier, and protecting that skin barrier to do its function, which is to be breathe out and breathe in. I think that's a really important shift for people to make, that they don't think that their clothing, their textiles, and what's around them is somehow separate from them and not going to affect their health in certain ways. Yeah. The research out of NIH and some of their departments, Dr. Ian Miles, I think is not just fascinating, but I think shows that our skin microbiome is just like our gut microbiome, is made up of both beneficial bacteria and bacteria that's not bad for us. So it's called dysbiosis. When these things get out of sync, then that's when we see problems. And instead of throwing, topical steroids and medication at it, I think there's a lot of opportunity for natural fibers to be used in that context and to stay away from the synthetic. So I think the research is coming that will show this in more and more ways, especially as the awareness grows.
And fun fact, actually, people are so afraid of toxic shock syndrome related to tampons. Well, there have been no recorded cases of toxic shock syndrome in pure cotton tampons, it's always the ones that have a synthetic blended into them for some reason. So that's really interesting. The other thing that I wanted to say, because somebody was asking for like the best evidence we have, um, as a skeptic, like how do we know that this is happening? Some of the reasons why we know this is happening is so for example, when the Alaskan airline attendants got their uniforms and some like over 20% of them started having reactions, strong enough to report them to the union, right? And so there was a big study out of Harvard where they had surveyed a lot of flight attendants at all these different major airlines before the introduction of these uniforms, just by random. They were just like, okay, describe all your symptoms. And so they ended up surveying the Alaska airline attendants after the introduction of the uniform, asking the same questions. What kind of symptoms are you showing? And they showed that symptoms like vision problems, rashes, chemical sensitivity, a whole host of them, roughly more or less doubled. All the symptoms more or less doubled after the introduction of the uniforms. So there was something definitely going on with those uniforms, and it was a really strong case study because it's like they all got them at the same time. They wear them for like up to 24 hours, depending on what kind of flights they're doing. And they could talk to each other and compare. It is really hard to connect these things back to fashion because we all wear different things all the time. So there's like you'd have to do like a controlled experiment essentially, but there's enough evidence showing that, we know that lead is bad. We know
I
that
was just thinking about the example of lead paint, Alden, as well.
yeah, we know there's no safe level of exposure for children to lead paint and to lead, and it's been found in children's products. We researchers are coalescing now around the fact that there's no safe level of exposure to endocrine disruptors. They do a lot of damage at very, very, very low levels, and the kinds of levels that we're seeing just coming off of, for example, like firefighter uniforms that have a PFAS protective layer on them. Like we're seeing those levels coming off, or children's school uniforms. We're seeing those levels coming off the uniforms at a much, much, much higher level, like 1,000 times more. We're talking like, PFAS can be toxic at parts per billion, and it's coming off of children's uniforms at a parts per million level. So we know these chemicals are toxic. A lot of people like to say, oh, well, the dose makes a poison. And how do you know the dosage is enough? But I mean, for endocrine disruptors, for lead, like the dose doesn't make the poison. It just shouldn't be there.
Yeah, we're actively in our clinic studying this concept with the PFAS and the Nomex and then in the firefighter turnouts. I think for many years the data is also confusing because firefighters are exposed to so much stuff, period, on their day-to-day job. So I think a lot of times they're relating the rashes and some of the other stuff to other components. But we now, as of the last year, have the ability to test for these off urine, and we've been doing that at this point. One thing that's really interesting that we've just discovered in 2 small pilot studies of firefighters is that we do seem to be able to get the PFAS out of the firefighters. We're not sure what or how it's doing it, but we did our general regular detox protocol, and then on remeasuring, the levels do seem to be dropping. So we're trying to figure out exactly what it is that can help remove the PFAS from the body.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to textiles, um, it's just the way I think about textiles is if you have a patient and for any reason and you're advising them, for example, uh, a patient who's having trouble getting pregnant. And I know a lot of fertility doctors don't do this, but some do. They say, hey, before you go through this process, get plastic out of your kitchen and get personal care products that have parabens and phthalates and other endocrine disruptors, scented products out of your medicine cabinet. And, you know, like there's things you can do to reduce, like don't touch receipts, all of these things. Fashion should be a part of that discussion. You should also be saying, hey, only wear natural fiber, cotton, or merino wool underwear, or silk if you want to be fancy. You know, try not to wear synthetic clothing if you can help it. Like this is another empowering piece of information. If your patient has skin issues, like don't just ask them if they're using fragrance laundry detergent. Ask them what else they're wearing. And give them and tell them that, you know, maybe they could try wearing natural fibers and avoiding super bright saturated colors, and like you wash your clothes before you wear them, and you know, don't wear ultra fast fashion brands that are, you know, that they're buying off the internet. Like there's things you, this is supposed to be another tool in your toolkit, right? If you're telling them to overhaul their diet to address a sort of mysterious health issue, like tell them that like this is another thing that they should be looking at.
Those are excellent tips for our doctor audience here. Just checking in on the time, we're gonna begin wrapping it up here. What gives you guys the most hope around this topic? What are you excited about moving forward?
Is some regulation. So for example, New York, Minnesota, and California have banned PFAS, and Vermont have banned PFAS in apparel, everyday apparel, cosmetics, some other products. So that's really exciting because it not only will help address PFAS, if a brand needs to get PFAS out of its supply chain and make sure there's no contamination or anything, they're going to have to get to know who's dyeing their stuff. And a lot of brands have no idea what dye houses are dyeing their stuff or what chemicals they're using. So that's really, really exciting. It's also exciting that people are just becoming more aware of this, that just textiles can be toxic, and that, you know, this is something that they should be looking at. That's really exciting for me just to know that um, that's coming up. And it's really nice for me to get emails from people saying like, hey, you know, I had this problem, I read your book, and my life is better now because of knowing this information.
And for you, Karen?
Well, I agree. Regulatory change may be slow, but I think it's inevitable and it is coming. Transparency in labels, but in even this conversation raises the awareness level that brands and companies that want to do better can do better, right? There are resources out there. There are experts talking about this, and there are ways to make these changes, and though changes may take time. And then we get feedback all the time of the positive difference in people's health and well-being and just peace of mind in having the education, having the choice, and making these small changes without stress. I think it's important to note that the whole world can look very toxic when people learn about these issues, and taking small steps, continuing the conversation, and keeping the stress out of it with actionable steps. I mean, we're all about that.
I love that. Let's end on that. Thank you so much, Karen and Alden, for all your hard work. Azome and their beautiful, amazing products. And Alden, I loved your book. It was fascinating. I think all doctors should read it to learn more about the topic and understand how this is interplaying with our health. Thank you
Yeah,
so much
thank you for
again.
having me. This has been great.
And thank you, AHAM, for hosting this.
Thank you.
you.